almost 8 years ago. I worked with Michael Gracie, who's a well-known commercials director. I said, we should do a film together. He goes, yeah, whatever, Jackman.
Hello and welcome to I Helped Make That. I'm your host, Kevin Higgins, and here is my guest, Josh Victor Rothstein. He is a director. He is a cinematographer. He is a still photographer. He is a behind-the-scenes documentarian. He is a jack of all trades. And Josh, do you think that maybe one day you could be a podcaster?
Wow. Well, thank you for the intro. Yeah, it certainly seems like I'm moving down the list here. And now podcasting and podcasts, it's a wonderful new medium. So thanks for having me on the show. I'm happy to be your guest here today.
Yeah, you're welcome. So if you ever maybe want to create a podcast, you know what I would suggest you should use?
Do tell.
Anchor. You know why Anchor?
Tell me.
It's so easy to use. All you have to do is get an account, record your podcast, get the podcast linked up to Google Podcast, Apple Podcast, all the platforms, and you've done half of the work, buddy. All you really need to do is promote yourself and get your podcast out there.
Marvelous.
Yeah, so if you want to create a podcast, or if anyone listening to this wants to create a podcast, I would suggest using Anchor. All right, so as I just said, Josh Victor Rothstein is a jack of all trades. But not only that, he has a working relationship with some very well-known people, including Hugh Jackman and Baz Luhrmann. He was a cinematographer and director on the Hugh Jackman documentary Seeds of Hope. He was a cinematographer on many short films that Baz Luhrmann directed, and he was the EPK and behind the scenes, as well as the still photographer on The Great Gatsby, the featurette cinematographer on The Wolverine, and what we'll be mostly focusing on today, the behind-the-scenes documentarian on The Greatest Showman. However, Josh, tell me, how did you develop that working relationship with Hugh and Baz in the first place?
Yeah, well, it started back in 2008, if I'm remembering correctly. When Hugh Jackman first hosted the Oscars. And at that time, I had a colleague, a friend of mine from back in the day who had worked with Baz Luhrmann. And Baz was coming off of making Australia with Hugh Jackman just a couple months earlier. So that whole group was pretty tight at the time, the Baz Luhrmann world and the Hugh Jackman world, as they had spent quite a long period of time making that Australian epoch. And so I had some good tie-ins to Baz Luhrmann's camp. And because Baz was directing one of the numbers in the Oscars, I don't know if you guys remember, but that year that Hugh hosted was a really incredible performance that he put on as the host. Funny enough, actually, Hugh ended up winning, and the team there ended up winning an Emmy for the opening number of the Oscars. You guys should Google that on YouTube. It's pretty incredible, the opening number. So there was an unbelievable amount of effort. Granted, that's put in every year for all the hosts of large shows like this, but the whole camp there sort of had the sense that it was a special effort going in there, and a lot of really incredible participants and cameos from people like Baz Luhrmann, Beyonce, and Zac Efron, and all sorts of folks ended up popping up in some of those cameos for the musicals. And so, I had the incredible privilege of documenting that whole experience. It was a 2-week. It was 15 straight days. I'll never forget of following Hugh Jackman around as he was preparing to host the Oscars, and just watching his rapport with Baz Luhrmann and being a fly on the wall. And it was a tremendous challenge because although I was referred by a sort of a close-knit friend, I still had to really ingratiate myself and build the trust of that crew, very tight-knit crew. Anytime you're coming as an outsider into a group like that, it takes a little while for people to, have the trust in you. So it was sort of a slow burn over the course of the 15 days of trying to get closer and closer to the action. And by the end, I guess you could say I made the cut as I was invited back to do additional work with Baz Luhrmann's camp on, as you pointed out, on The Great Gatsby, and I went on to do several projects with Hugh Jackman.
So, just out of curiosity, how did you get into the Oscars in the first place?
So, a friend of mine named Jason Ryan, who's now a producer at Wildcard 3 AM, he had worked for many years with Baz Luhrmann as an assistant in the early 2000s. They had worked on Moulin Rouge, and he put in a lot of time in Baz's camp. And when the Oscars came up, they reached out to Jason and asked him if he had any friends in New York that were documentary filmmakers. And Jason and I had just reconnected, and I had finished a documentary film called 3 Points, a feature documentary film about the Darfur conflict. Couldn't be any more different, right? In terms of a point of view for a filmmaker to go from coming off of being in Darfur refugee camps and watching the atrocities that were playing out in that region to then being asked to do time at the Oscars. But I think from Jason's point of view as a producer, he knew that I could, I guess, as he put it, sort of be dropped in anywhere and document and sort of, be a one-man band. So he wasn't so much looking for someone at the time with a point of view who understood all the machinations of the celebrity, but more he was looking for a documentary filmmaker that would be able to sort of withstand going 15 straight days and flying back and forth between, all these different parts of the country that we ended up covering.
So now tell us, for the viewers who may not know, what is a still photographer and a behind-the-scenes documentarian?
Well, I'll start with the behind-the-scenes documentarian. I mean, obviously, if you're a documentary filmmaker, you know how to document, and some documentary filmmakers come up and sort of focus on any number of subjects. It can be journalism, it could be social issues, human rights issues. It could be really anything, right? So I think we all know what a documentary filmmaker is. But to be a behind-the-scenes documentary filmmaker just means that you're embedded on a film set, and it's your job to document the process of how a film unfolds. And that can mean everything from what's happening on set, just sort of adjacent to the main stage, to what's happening, in the catacombs behind the stage, right? The wardrobe, everything from hair and makeup to miniatures that the design team are creating, to musicals that are being rehearsed in sort of gringy rehearsal spaces, sort of all the less glamorous stuff that's lit perfectly and choreographed perfectly. It's a chance really to document process. So behind the scenes documentary filmmaker is somebody who's, I think has to first and foremost have, right, the I guess the technicalities, the ability to shoot, but also to have the curiosity. And for me, that was really a big deal, is that when I first got involved with doing some of this work, I was much more of a still photographer and a documentary filmmaker than I was a narrative filmmaker. I'm now working more narratively and working on scripted projects, but in my own creation, my own creativity. But that by and large really was birthed and informed by learning for a couple of years and being exposed to narrative filmmaking but from my point of view, observing it and learning as behind the scenes documentary filmmaker. And so to answer your question about what is a still photographer, a still photographer is a photographer who I was for many years focused as a portrait photographer in the music business. Sort of in the late 90s, I landed into New York City after being away for a couple of years in university. When I came back to New York, I had a lot of friends that were musicians, and I started documenting and shooting portraits and shooting publicity stills and album art for rockers on the Lower East Side, and all sorts of, it was a wonderful time for the New York City rock scene, with Interpol and the Strokes and the Yeah Yeah Yeahs and the Walkmen, and it was a really fun time to have an interest as being a still photographer. So I worked as a still photographer for many years and eventually branched into shooting advertising and other type of still photography that came of that career path.
Okay, cool. So when you got the job to be a director on Seeds of Hope, which was, besides the Oscars, your first collaboration with Hugh Jackman, how was it traveling all the way to Ethiopia to make that documentary?
Yeah, well, the documentary itself actually became two different films. Seeds of Hope was the first version of that film that was released. It was a 26-minute TV film that came out in Australia. And then that film actually grew into a feature-length documentary called Dukali's Dream, which was a full-length feature documentary film that essentially took the first part of Seeds of Hope and then we filmed a sort of a whole second half of it. As the years went on, there was some wonderful developments. So yeah, making that film was really a fascinating experience because I got to learn a lot about the concepts behind fair trade and direct trade, and the concept of conscious capitalism. And there were some concepts there that I was sort of vaguely familiar with. But for me, as just somebody who's interested in finding ways to improve the world and support means of empowerment, learning about fair trade was really a powerful experience. So from a filmmaker standpoint, it was interesting because that film, when we filmed Seeds of Hope, Dukali's Dream, it was just a couple years after I had been making the Darfur film, but the technology had changed so much in the span of 5 years that it was such an easier process to do. It was when I filmed the 3 Points, that, as I alluded to, the documentary film about Darfur refugees, it was such a challenge to deal with the technicalities of the equipment, right? Just so in the span of a couple of years, I mean, it's a little nerdy to get into, so I won't get into all the details, but we benefited from sort of being at a moment where all of a sudden memory cards were much larger and things like that. So the actual shooting of the film itself of with Hugh and the folks in Ethiopia there, Dukali and his family, technically was not a great challenge. I think the greatest challenge of that film, though, was just figuring out what our story was. The film really inherently, in the spirit of fair trade, is not about people coming in and helping others out, but it's about having trade relationships with individuals in other countries, and in turn, sort of mutually benefiting. As it's sort of the nature of a fair trade cooperative and so on, is that individuals, farmers, communities have a resource, and there's a demand for it, and therefore an opportunity to engage in that trade. And so it's a matter of giving fair prices to those individuals. And so, in many ways, I guess what I'm speaking to is an extension of some of the lessons that we learned from that film. I would definitely encourage viewers to check it out. Dukali's Dreams, the full-length version of it, and you can find it on Amazon at the moment.
Many of your projects are you working with people you know. In fact, the reason I first heard about you is that I watched this great short film, your first narrative short film, I believe, Every Other Weekend,
Mhm.
starring Keala Settle. And everyone, if you think Keala was great in The Greatest Showman, which we'll talk about in a minute, you got to watch Every Other Weekend because she is fantastic in that movie. So what caused you to make the shift from documentary to narrative cinema?
I mean, I think that I wouldn't maybe define it as a shift. I would just say sort of like extension of my interest in filmmaking. Um, just as I had an interest in still photography, I always had an interest in documentary filmmaking and narrative filmmaking. I've never felt a strong bias about saying like I want to be one thing. I think sometimes I certainly met photographers along the way that felt like they were a photographer and that was sort of what they were going to do and sort of wouldn't deviate. I've personally always been interested in visual mediums. I mean, I'm also interested in music and all sorts of mediums of expression. So it was really just the timing was right. It's something. It's always been a dream of mine since I was a young kid. Would be to do scripted narrative work, but it had to come about at the right time. You sort of had to be ready. Some people sort of jump into that space and just sort of be like, all right, I'm going to learn on the go. Personally, I didn't feel that way about scripted and narrative work. I really wanted to have a feeling before I jumped into that world that I knew the craft before I jumped into it. And through my years as a documentary filmmaker, as we talked about, working behind the scenes on feature films and other opportunities, I felt like I got a really unique education by being close up and observing and sort of seeing the craft of scripted and narrative work that when the opportunity sort of was in front of me, I felt really confident about going for it.
Okay, yeah, I can relate to that. Like when I was young, I wanted to be an actor mainly. But as I've grown older, I've realized maybe producing is more my calling. But then there are times where I'm thinking, oh, I still kind of want to write or I still want to act.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually I want to try to do it all. But as of now, I feel like I'm more just in the producing space, though I did make my own podcast narrative called What I Just Saw back in 2019.
Mm.
So,
Yeah.
that being said, let's talk about what's in the title, The Greatest Showman. So, you were not only a behind the scenes documentarian on that, but you created like behind the scenes ads. How
Yeah.
did how did that come up?
Um, so the friend that I mentioned, one of my frequent collaborators in this business is Jason Ryan, who I mentioned works at a company called Wildcard 3 a.m. And Jason and I have known each other for a very long time, and we have a lot of trust. We did some great work for a couple of years with Usain Bolt and Puma, and so we had some experience on that. We had experience on the Oscars, as we touched upon. And so Jason and I had a good working relationship. Jason's sister, Allison Temple, worked at Fox for many years and started this company, 3 a.m. and Wildcard, and they're a tremendous company, very powerful post house, and they started doing some digital content. And we had a conversation early on about the possibility that I would do some behind the scenes on the film, sort of directly related to the fact, of course, that Hugh was starring on the film, and I guess the sense was that because I had a rapport with Hugh, it might give sort of open up an opportunity to have some unique access. Because at the end of the day, on these films, I mean, it's a challenge to find the balance of documenting what's happening but not disrupting it.
Mhm.
And that's sort of the sweet spot and the balancing act that a behind the scenes documentary filmmaker has to take, is that they're not controlling what's happening. Obviously, it's my job to observe the filmmaking process, But then ideally, I could insert myself to ask questions in sort of a off the cuff moment, or obviously there's sort of more formal sit downs, and those, are essential for an EPK. But what I was more interested in, and I think, Allison Temple and Jason Ryan were interested in, was there an opportunity to sort of really get some first person perspective from Hugh and from some of the cast members while they were in the midst of making the film? Because you don't see that very often in filmmaking. Typically, behind the scenes EPKs are the formal, like, you see the action from the point of view of the camera, and then you cut to somebody in the chair and they're, in hair and makeup already, and they're, oh, when we filmed this, so on and so forth. But we really wanted to try to go for something a little bit more personal. So on one of the first days that we started off, I had a conversation with Hugh and sort of just mentioned to him that we were hoping to approach it that way, and just to get a sense, was he open to that? Because if he said no, listen, I'm not going to want to do that, like, I have to focus on this, then obviously I wouldn't push it. But he seemed interested in the idea too. I also met with the producers of the film, and eventually with Michael Gracie, the director of the film, and let everyone know that, hey, listen, guys, we have this really cool opportunity. If we all participate, if you guys could be open to the possibility of having this sort of almost like a video journaling, like in the moment, like after a take, if it feels appropriate and you see me, like, come over and be like, hey, this just happened, and so forth and so on. And then you'd really sort of suck the viewer into the moment. So I got the thumbs up from everyone that they wanted to do that. But the hard part was then actually asserting myself to actually grab those moments, because it's very intimidating to be on a set and have, you can see the pressure and the stakes of what's being, the attention that's required and the focus. So to like find those moments of when I'm going to like actually step in here and ask someone a question, when like, you start to just feel like a little bee that's just buzzing around the room and, bugging people. And, certainly that's not the vibe that I want to put off. And, and it's not going to yield itself to like, getting invited back the next day. So a lot of this type of filmmaking for me is just about patience. And I spent a tremendous amount of time on this film not shooting, just so that I could show people there that I wasn't sort of stepping on the process. And oftentimes, just by being like really patient and pulling like crazy long hours there, like I would get there before the day started. Sometimes I would leave even in the middle of the day, because I could just see that like being there wasn't going to be, there wouldn't be an opportunity and I'd be in the way. And then I'd come back at the end of the day and just sort of wait and just try to see like what might reveal itself and who might be available. So I think a lot of it is like just not pushing, at moments when you can tell that people are not going to be open. So it took a long, long time to gather up all the materials for this type of, we were calling it a mini documentary, because I think it really was at the end of the day. And, I guess just the last thing just to touch upon, the other big challenge that myself and some of the other folks that were helping me do the shooting on this that we have is that, this is not what a lot of the producers of the film want. They don't want behind the scenes cameramen speaking to their A-list stars and pulling their attention away from memorizing lines or, getting some downtime. So, I definitely ran into moments where I knew I was not wanted, and I was overtly told that by people on the film. They were always respectful about it, but, it's a challenge to sort of have, some aspects of the filmmaking team really not want you there. And then knowing though that I have a job and that my presence and sort of being proactive is an essential part of actually getting my work done. So there's a lot of sort of psychological warfare and, like a lot of politics.
There's always like that pressure of when you're working at any part of the entertainment industry, like, you want to grow, but you also want to do it in a way that doesn't turn people off. And it's sometimes hard to know where the boundaries lie within
Yeah.
certain people. Like, do I come off too needy? If they don't, respond to me in a week, did I push them away?
Right.
In fact, I was nervous to do this podcast at first because, you know, I'm sorry. I don't like The Greatest Showman as a movie.
Mhm.
I can't say it's the first movie that I've interviewed someone about where I didn't really care for the movie itself.
Mhm.
In fact, last interview, I interviewed Patrick Bristow, who was in Showgirls, and he didn't like the movie either, and I didn't like the movie. That's not a very popular movie. It's more surprising when someone does like it. But there's always that pressure, in the entertainment industry where you have to wonder, like, first, what can I do to further my career without pushing people away? It's hard to tell sometimes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'm sure this is true for any industry in general. So, that being said, tell me now, how did Every Other Weekend, the movie you made with Kiala, come to be? What was that inspired by?
Well, the film came about. I mean, I'll also, I guess, speak to the relationship with Kiala and then the sort of story itself. But since we're on the topic of The Greatest Showman, I'll just mention that I met her, of course, because she's playing the bearded lady, Letty Lux, in the film. And she obviously has a really big role. And so I spent a fair bit of time on set with Kiala and got to know her, got to hear her story and get a sense of her process. And it was also very fascinating to see somebody who was clearly right at the cusp of about to become massively famous and very well known. And somebody who had put in so much time in her career on Broadway, so much hard work, behind her talent, but her opportunity, she's an example of somebody who had opportunity and got a break, but, certainly put some extraordinary hours in before that came about. And so in hearing about Kiala's life, she talked about challenges that she had with her personal life, with her parents and her mother in particular. And I couldn't help but sort of reflect on some experiences I had with my father growing up. And so I've had a story in mind for many years about a very sort of weird, dysfunctional childhood that I had. And I've always sort of tried to figure out how I would convey that. Personally, I always felt reluctant about the idea of just doing straight autobiographical depictions of my past. And then in meeting Kiala, I started to consider the possibility of sort of telling a story that was not necessarily, sort of note for note, beat for beat depiction of or sort of like an exact portrayal, but more just a depiction and like in spirit, sort of inspired by. I happened to be working at the time with a really talented writer named Candace Little, who was doing some freelance work for me at the time on The Greatest Showman. And she was very interested in scripted work and narrative. And so as having a female co-writer was an opportunity to then sort of just really imagine the possibilities of just sort of flipping my whole world upside down and looking at a child's experience through another lens. So we took, childhood experiences that I had as a boy with my brother and our father, and just flipped the whole world upside down and changed the genders and made the experience about a young girl dealing with challenges with her mother. And so once we did that, it allowed me to access stories and experiences that I otherwise probably would not want to share or unearth, because it just feels sometimes like you're just airing dirty laundry. And so I could also see in Kiala that she had, that there was this tremendous depth to her, who she was as a person, And I was very curious to see her dramatic acting chops. On The Greatest Showman, certainly, like, whether you like the film or not, there's no denying that Keala is an extraordinary talent in that film. And it is apparent, and it is now evident to anyone that's seen her in anything she does, that she was tremendous. And so it was a chance. It was just really good timing. I approached her with the idea towards the end of the filmmaking. We went out for a lunch and said to her, look, I've heard a lot about your life, and I've really appreciated the opportunity to interview you and get a sense of that. And I have to tell you, we have a lot in common. I haven't told you about anything to do with my life. And I told her a little bit about it, and I said it would be an honor to work on a project to show your dramatic acting chops. And she said, I love this idea. Let's do it. The only problem is I'm leaving town in 2 weeks. So we have to film in 2 weeks. So we had just crammed this script together. My producer, dear friend Skylar Weiss, somehow pulled rabbit out of the hat and got all of our permitting, got our crew together, and we went out and we filmed it and did it. Sometimes that's the way it happens. Sometimes you sort of, you need some deadline to just, create some parameters and framework to get your work done. And, it was sort of a blessing in many ways, the fact that Keala was moving. She was moving from New York to LA. And the fact that was happening, and she had all this publicity she had to do for Greatest Showman, forced our hand to make the film. So yeah, if anyone wants to see that film Every Other Weekend, we haven't released it publicly, in part because we wrote a feature script version of that film. And that's in development right now. We're still working on putting pieces of that together. So we didn't want to release the short until that story was underway. But I guess if anyone wants to see it, they could contact me directly, or, hit you up, Kevin, and I can send a link. But you can reach me or one of my producers through my website, info@joshvictorrothstein.com, and make the request, and we'll send you guys a Vimeo link.
Okay, that is a very interesting story. And yeah, I do agree that as much as I disliked The Greatest Showman as a whole, Keala was one of the best things about it. She did kill This Is Me. And, even though I feel like her character could have had more screen time and more development personally, I do think with what she was given, she acted those scenes well. And that's why, if anyone ever wants to see Every Other Weekend, you get the little bit of what you saw in The Greatest Showman from her in the movie. It's basically a whole movie of that, just without the beard. And I guess that's also, not to compare, the two movies, because one is a big budget, family friendly musical, and the other is an independent short film for adults. But I guess that was sort of the thing, which is that Every Other Weekend felt like a more personal story, while, in my opinion, The Greatest Showman seemed to want to be about everything and reach a bunch of people, but it led to kind of an unfocused story. It couldn't make up its mind if it wanted to be about anti-racism, anti-ableism, learning the limits of reaching your dreams, etc. And I guess that's sort of the thing. I'm drawn more to personal stories than I am movies that try to be about everything all at once. What kind of stories do you feel more attached to?
I mean, yeah, I tend to be more interested in personalized stories. Admittedly, yes, I'm not by default, musical hound myself. It's not my genre that I grew up being passionate. It's not what inspired me to be an artist.
Me neither, really.
But I look at it as just another medium. And I think that, yeah, they're both films, but I'm also not into horror film, but I have friends that are into horror, and I've at times tried to understand it, because I'm like, why would you watch something that's negative and makes you upset and, causes people to lose sleep and so forth? Like, I don't get it at all. Like, viscerally, why would I want to take that in? Why would I want to put that out to the world? But I've had friends explain it to me, and I'm like, oh, okay, I get it. It's like a roller coaster ride. And, there's certain, so one of the things I've realized is like, certainly I could tell you a little bit more about what I dig, but I realized that when you watch a film and you sort of realize like, okay, this is a different genre. So in other words, when I watch The Greatest Showman, I'm not watching that film. And I guess I've learned to watch musicals in a very different way. I don't have the same, I don't think they're sort of trying to fill the sort of sense of realism. It's not the type of filmmaking that I make or sort of want to create in terms of like with Every Other Weekend and other films that I'm much more interested into a naturalistic style of acting and depicting of life.
Mm-hmm.
But, musicals, I think, are doing something very different. Inherently, people are singing and dancing like it's bizarre and doesn't make any sense, but it's, sort of brings you into another world. It's a fantasy. So, knowing that those type of films are fantasies, I now watch them in a different way. Through my daughter who's now 11, my daughter Ren, she got into watching musicals a couple years ago. And I had never watched like some of the classics. I had never seen like Singing in the Rain, and we went back and watched all the classics, and it was cool to watch it. After working on The Greatest Showman, I found that I had an appreciation for the craft and the effort that goes into, you're combining music, the work that went into, that Justin Paul and Benji Pasek made. They wrote these incredible stories, and then it's a merging of these two mediums. And so, I sort of now look at musicals in a very different way. But I guess to answer your question about, the type of films that I'm interested in, like my capabilities sort of fall more into the naturalistic space. Like that's what moves me, and that's what I'm interested. I'm interested in good acting. When I say good, I mean naturalistic. I'm interested in camera work that feels like it's, at times, informed from the point of view of a camera and really has the intention to pull you into the moment in a way that with less grandiosity of like a big crane shot that you would see in a musical, right? So yeah, I mean, I'm a huge fan of Paul Thomas Anderson, and I'm a huge fan of some old school Hitchcock and Stanley Kubrick films, and the work that I tend to be sort of interested in and emulating, though I guess to sort of put a pin in it, is one thing. But I've developed, as I've gotten older, a sort of a greater tolerance for work that I don't love. And I sort of can look at creative process, think in a different way at this stage of my life, feel less angry about it. I think I used to be really sort of pissed off if I saw something that like didn't immediately match my taste. And now I'm like, okay, all right, people just have a different thing that floats their boat, and that's fine. That's cool.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I'll admit, when I was younger, it was the same thing. I used to be angry, at movies that didn't really reach my taste. But, as I've worked on film sets and seen how hard people work, like I just can't get angry. Even when it comes to movies I do hate, when I'm reading other people's reactions online, sometimes I'm like, come on, it's just a movie.
Yeah.
Like, chill.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, different strokes for different folks. Like, music is the same way. Like, some people are into a type of music that I don't dig, but I get it moves you. Like I will say in defense of The Greatest Showman, whether, you or others like sort of liked it, it's undeniable that if you look at the response that film got, is it moved people. It really did touch people in an extraordinary way. And I would say sort of despite the fact that the film got a terrible positioning out of the gate, Disney had just bought Fox. So Fox didn't even get to push that film out properly. Some of the digital assets that we created ended up being really important as a result of that, because the film had been it was really botched the way it was. But the reason that film became successful, The Greatest Showman, was nothing to do with the positioning and the marketing. People loved it. Young kids would go and see the film, and then they would say, oh my God, I have to bring my grandma. this is like a throwback to films that she used to love. Or they would then bring their best friend and be like, oh my God. So it became this sort of cult classic. It's one of these sort of real underdog stories. If you were to look at the graph of what happened when that film came out, it tanked. It was quickly panned.
I remember that.
Yeah, and then people loved it, and it touched people. And I do understand your point that it was trying to do too much, but when it resonated, the concept of inclusivity and the idea of people feeling like they're a reject and the oddities, it touched the chord with people, and I think really uplifted people at a time where it was really needed. And for whatever reason, it's sort of a phenomena. This film, The Greatest Showman, is one of these sort of really bizarre films, because I know that a lot of critics really didn't like it, but it had extraordinary resonance with people, I think, for reasons that are thematically directly tied to the film.
Yeah, I can see that. I guess it was just, I wanted more, I wanted more of the oddities. I wanted more screen time. I wanted more time with them.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to know more about them as people.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, they focused more on P.T. Barnum, which is why I didn't feel the same way those other people felt, that it worked as a message of inclusion, because it felt to me like the movie was excluding the oddities themselves, which I think is another problem I had with it. I wanted more Bearded Lady. I wanted more Tom Thumb.
Yeah.
I wanted more Yahya Abdul-Mateen II. I didn't want The Greatest Showman. I wanted The Greatest Show.
Yeah, that's valid. That's cool.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, perhaps in some ways, the way that the film didn't give you enough might be why for some folks it piqued their interest. There was just enough that people were like, oh my God, I want to watch that again just to get a taste of it. It is an imperfect film. I think all films are imperfect, but it had enough going on that, the film, what's strange about it, Kevin, is that, all those things you're saying, I think, have tremendous validity to them. But it was a phenomenon. The film became a classic. I will tell you one thing about it that's really interesting. Since we're on the topic of The Greatest Showman, and we are doing a podcast, when I was a part of that film, and I feel really lucky to have been able to witness the extraordinary things that were created in it, albeit imperfect. But as we touched upon, it really tanked getting out of the gate, and then had this unbelievable surge. I mean, it was extraordinary what happened. And my daughter, who I guess at the time, she's in 5th grade now, she must have been in 2nd grade. Her group of friends just became ravenous about that film. And the whole school, it was the funniest thing, because the song, This Is Me, became this ubiquitous song that, like, so in my studio where I am right now, we had like 5 editors in here for like 6 months cranking on This Is Me and all the songs that were in that film. Like, if any of your viewers have ever worked on an edit, like, those songs just get stuck in your head, right? It's just like, you're just like, at the end of the day, it's like, it's all you can think about is, This Is Me, and all the songs. And so it was the most bizarre thing. I work in my studio here is in Brooklyn in Carroll Gardens, and right next to our studio is a dance studio where kids have after school and so forth. And sometimes we can hear the music that's coming through the wall, and you could hear, like, whatever stuff they're dancing to. And a couple months after the film, we're sitting here, and all of a sudden through the wall, you hear This Is Me being played. The kids are dancing to it. And so we had spent like months of blasting that film, like in secret in here, like the film hadn't been released. And it was such a bizarre thing, where the unfolding of the phenomenon of that film. And then a couple weeks after that, for my daughter's end of the year graduation, her entire 2nd grade class came out and sang This Is Me as like their end of the year song. And it was just this wonderful experience. I saw that film from the early days, as the sketches and all the process that it goes through to make a film, to then see how infectious that song in particular became, and to have been there with Kiala and talked about the possibilities of the impact of that song and how it might impact people in a positive way, the important message of of that. It was a really amazing experience that I'm remembering now. And then I would get calls from like my daughter's friends. They would a couple of times, like these kids were having a birthday party and it was like somehow themed around The Greatest Showman. I sent them a link to like a long cut of a version of the behind the scenes that we had that was like a 25-minute cut of like the mini doc all streamed together. And the kids watched that at their birthday party. And it was just really fun to be a part of like that moment in time when that film was like having such a massive impact on these young kids. And again, I understand your point about sort of wanting more and some of the misses, but for a lot of people, the moments that connected and resonated, just were, very powerful and profound. And so it was a cool experience just to see. It became a cultural phenomena for a couple months. Yeah, it was beautiful to see the impact that had on people.
Yeah. I'm not going to take that away from anyone, especially not kids. Like,
oh yeah, I set you up to defend it against. Now, I'm not in any way putting this as a conversation between your dislike of it. I'm
no.
Reminiscing about.
Mm-hmm.
I haven't spoken, really thought about this for years, much less spoken about it. So, I just mean more in the sort of the spirit of fondly conveying to your viewers and recollecting what a beautiful experience it was.
Of course,
from my point of view.
And I'm glad you had that experience. And I'll have to admit, as much as I disliked it or any movie, I'll admit when it first came out, I was kind of Elaine Barnes to The English Patient about that film, if you know what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Really? I thought it was pretty good. Oh, come on. Good? What was good about it?
But yeah, I'll admit some of my behavior towards that film does kind of make me cringe looking back. And also makes me feel hypocritical because I don't really like it when people do what Elaine Barnes did to The English Patient.
Mm-hmm.
Like, remember back in 2013, like there were so many people just going, "What's the deal with Frozen? Why is everyone so obsessed with Frozen? Shut up about Frozen." Remember that?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was like, it's not Disney's best, but it's a decent movie.
Yeah.
I don't see why people are hating it just because people are kind of overhyping it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, listen, it's the age-old thing with the arts, right? I mean, it happens with music all the time. There's no denying, when something resonates, it resonates. And I'll say that, for The Greatest Showman, to its credit, unlike a pop song that gets crammed down your throat, right? Like literally, like, where you just like after a while, like, I don't even know if I like this song. It's just stuck in my head. That film, wasn't pushed out far and wide and didn't have that thing where like the trailer was on 24/7, but it just through the word of mouth, it happened to work. And I do have to say, I'm sort of, I guess, bringing the musical example into it because the music is so fantastic in that film, as I mentioned earlier with the work that Benj and Justin did. So, obviously they went on to do Dear Evan Hansen, and those guys have a tremendous track record. So, yeah, you just never know as a filmmaker. I guess as somebody, and I have friends that make films. It's always a tricky thing. You just never know what's going to resonate and what the metrics are for you, right? It's like, people aren't going to like your film, but the audience does. Or sometimes it's the other way. Sometimes a film, like critics can love it and it doesn't work with the audience. So, I've seen both happen for artists and filmmakers and creators. And our job as filmmakers is just to enjoy the experience when you're working on it, learn something from it, and then move on to the next thing. Keep your head up.
Yeah, that's definitely true. In fact, I was talking with Patrick about Showgirls. Like, he still kind of agrees with critics conscientious that it was a terrible film, but he still enjoys the cult status that movie got. And I think there's been many stories about that. I think Christopher Plummer with The Sound of Music. At first, I think he was also like, why is this so popular? Like, I worked on it and I think it's garbage.
Yeah.
But then, as he got older, he sort of learned to appreciate it.
It's an interesting thing to consider as a viewer is, can we allow our taste to evolve? Can we open our heart back up to something that we felt rigid about? And, like, I know that for myself, like I've said about musicals in general, whether it's Sound of Music or anything else, I think I just had something in me that was just like, I don't want to like musicals. Might have just been like, a macho male thing. I don't know. When I had a little girl and I just started to see the sort of what it felt like to like open yourself to the experience and allow the fantasy to be there and not have to, be so rigid about my expectation about the perfection of the character development and just to get swept away. Like, can a story sweep you away? And so it's a different lens and it's a different experience, to have. I think it's a fun challenge to sort of ask of yourself as a viewer is like, can you open yourself back up to something that you felt really rigid about? It's a good challenge to think about, like, hey, I watched something as a kid that I hated. Can I watch that again and consider it? Because I think to be really closed off to work, and I say this just as somebody I'm very interested in how to cultivate openness and vulnerability, right? So I'm completely closed off to liking something, whether it's like a film that I see or a song or whatever it is. If I'm collaborating with people and I sort of have that to myself, am I bringing that into the room as well? And why am I closed off to something and to what end? It doesn't mean to say that openness means that I'm just going to love everything, but there's sort of a balancing act of just trying to be receptive to the possibilities that there are other things out there, tastes and proclivities that people have that are different than yours. And that, obviously it's such a subjective process. And if you are going to be a communicator of whether it's writing or music or anything, it's I think a really important thing to learn that technique of being open, especially when you're in the room with somebody who's sharing ideas with you, is just to try to catch yourself to saying no. Even sometimes that's just a voice in your head. And it doesn't mean, again, that you're just sort of open to everything, but it's just sometimes when you can stay open to something early on, you'd be surprised about how that could grow into something that sort of genuinely can come around on and create something meaningful.
I agree. In fact, I will say that, even though I don't really hate musicals, I think I'm just more picky about them. But even then, there are musicals that are just pure fantasy and spectacle, like that you're talking about, that I do kind of enjoy. Like, I like Moulin Rouge. And Xanadu, though I wouldn't call it a good movie, I do think it's a fun movie. Maybe not always for the right reasons, but I think it's a fun movie. And in what you're saying about being open to things you weren't open to before, I didn't always like superhero movies. In fact, first time I saw The Dark Knight, I was like, I don't get the appeal. But, then I got into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I think I saw the second Iron Man at a friend's birthday party, and I started watching more superhero movies, and I did get into it. And, I did rewatch The Dark Knight, and I did enjoy it more the second time. So I get what you're saying, opening your mind up to other genres and maybe having it sort of change. In fact, there was a long time that I would watch nothing but comedies, but I am more open to other genres. And it's honestly gotten to a point where it's like, I still watch comedies, but it's not, I'm going to watch only comedies, and the types of comedies I liked when I was like 13 or 14 or whatever don't necessarily appeal to me now.
I mean, I think it's a very interesting conversation that what we're talking about, that this idea of feeling steadfast and rigid about what we like and don't like, and to just look at that and consider it. It's a larger conversation. I think it actually would be a great subject for a podcast. Hey, look at that. But just to sort of consider, like, what's that all about? What is this thing? The times can be it's sort of what we say we don't like in some ways is a real identity thing, if I think about it, right? And there's a lot of probably tribalism that's connected to that, in the sense of like, I'm going to take a stand on this thing, signaling something to the world, maybe even more than, it's safer than me saying I like something. That's for sure, right? And so with art, it can be a very personal thing to say what you like. Even my sort of saying that, I might like musicals now. There's a little boy inside of me who was very attached to my identity as like a tough male as a young kid. was just the way that I was raised. Played ice hockey, and I liked ice hockey fights and things like that. You know what I mean? It was like I was sort of raised by a dad who was very into that type of bravado. And so, as you sort of like grow older and you start to think about like, why you're shaped to dislike things, it's interesting. So I think it's just a fun challenge to consider looking at when, as an artist, this is personally something I'm going through at the moment, is what's coming up for me when I say I don't like something. Right. So for all arts, I find that to be a good challenge for myself at the moment, because I'm personally trying to write and create things at the moment in a lot of different genres. And so I find that the more that I can be open to understanding where people are connecting to a particular medium is very helpful to me, to sort of challenge the closing down that happens. Now, I will say this, Kevin, so the other side of this discussion, which is that it is important to understand why we think things work and don't work, and discerning about why we think something could be better. That's what directing and writing is all about, is the process of being, very critical and analytical about, not just giving yourself softballs the whole time. So I think that's equally, essential as a part of the process as people who are making work. But I think there's sort of two very important tools in the toolkit, and sort of how to wield them and to be around collaborators that sort of fairly use those tools together in a powerful way is really the magic of creating impactful work.
Yeah, I agree. And I'll admit, even though I still don't care for The Greatest Showman, I did like La La Land, Pasek and Paul's musical from the year before. And while I wouldn't call that a perfect movie either, why I think that movie did impact me is because it captured the struggle of a starving artist well, in my opinion, which is probably why I was actually drawn to that movie.
Because I've been to a million auditions, and the same thing happens every time, where I get interrupted because someone wants to get a sandwich, or I'm crying and they start laughing, or there's people sitting in the waiting room and they're like me but prettier and better because maybe I'm not good enough.
Yes, you are.
No, maybe I'm not.
Yes, you are.
Maybe I'm not.
You are.
Maybe I'm not.
You are.
Maybe I'm one of those people that has always wanted to do it, but it's like a pipe dream for me, and then you set it, you change your dreams, and then you grow up. Maybe I'm one of those people, and I'm not supposed to, and I can go back to school, and I can find something else that I'm supposed to do, because I left to do that, and it's been 6 years, and I don't want to do it anymore.
So sometimes when you're thinking of why a movie impacts you, it could be something as easy as, can I relate?
Yeah. Does it connect to my life experience in any way?
Yeah. And, I was shocked when La La Land also got that backlash because, I could relate to it and therefore was drawn to it. But I think it's also because at least some people who didn't like it probably couldn't relate to it as much. So I think there is a factor of relatability.
Yeah, relatability is a great point. I think it's an interesting, larger conversation. Maybe that's what you wanted to have here today. Maybe you're getting at exactly what you wanted on this show. But I think the question of what makes us like things, not like things, where do we sit with ourselves? What's our role in that, in terms of our own growth and creativity? Sometimes, like for me with La La Land, I initially did not like the film because I related to it and I thought it was too dreamy, and it was like, oh, I can relate to those struggles, but I don't like the way that they're sort of softening them. But then I actually came back and I watched it and I was like, all right, let me just watch it a little bit more like a fantasy and come back to it. And I liked it. I could appreciate it a lot more. And other times as a viewer, you might not like something because you don't relate to it at all. So like that sort of whole experience of like relating to it and then resenting it because it's not being represented properly, or I don't like it because I don't relate to it at all. And then sometimes it's like, oh, I don't relate to it at all, but as somebody who's voyeuristically now getting to experience that, that's really cool. There's all different parts to that.
Yeah, I agree. In fact, that's probably also why, even though critics loved it, I didn't like The Disaster Artist, if you've seen or remember that movie,
Mhm.
because that was also about a struggling actor and it was based on a true story. The actor in the movie, Greg, had an experience that could be relatable to some people. In fact, a lot of actors where he kept trying out for major roles and not getting any of them. But what I didn't particularly care for is that it was based on a true story. And the real Greg, he got a few like background gigs and small roles here and there, and was even the lead in like this B movie that you probably find in like the blockbuster $1 bin. But they felt that wasn't relatable enough to an audience, so they made it look like he was a complete loser.
Hmm.
And then, if that wasn't enough, they had this plot point later on in the movie that again did not happen at all, where his career, he could become a star by just being a woodsman in one episode of Malcolm in the Middle. And it's like, that's not how the entertainment industry works.
Right.
No one's going to care that you were a woodsman in one episode of Malcolm in the Middle.
Yeah.
That's not how his life experience actually worked. And I didn't care for how they made it seem like just being on one big TV show is all you need to have a successful career.
Yeah.
And I feel like anyone who's not in the entertainment industry who could see that movie would get the wrong idea and think, oh, they're going to be on TV, or they could have been on TV, they would have been set. Which kind of pissed me off and made me dislike the movie as a whole. And also didn't help that the movie was trying to be more gritty. It was trying to be more grounded. But then they had this complete fantasy of what an actor's life is like.
Greg is also an actor.
You are?
Yeah.
Cool. Anything I would have seen you in?
No, I doubt it.
You know, it's a journey. Are you working on anything at the moment?
Yes, yeah, actually, I'm doing this movie.
Movie?
Yeah.
Nice.
Yeah, but you know, I'd love to do TV at some point.
Yeah.
You know, sitcoms, drama, cop shows. Yeah, you name it, I would do it.
It's funny you mention that because I'm directing an episode of Malcolm right now. Next week, we're shooting the scene where the boys get lost, and Hal and Lois have to go find them in the woods, and we're having trouble finding this lumberjack role.
And you got this beard.
What do you think? You want to do it?
Are you serious?
Yeah, well, you know, everybody needs a break.
Yeah, man. I feel you.
Yeah, so that's probably, again, I didn't like it because even though I can relate to auditioning for big roles and not getting anything, I can't really relate to one big role being enough to be on my career. Like, I was a featured extra on Saturday Night Live. I had a close-up.
Mm-hmm.
And look at my bank account. Need I say more?
Right. You have that perspective, and therefore it allows you to have a connection or lack of connection with that story as a result. It's sometimes the fact that we have specific points of view, it allows us to, I guess that's what it's all about.
Yeah, well, thank you for being on.
Absolutely. It was really a fun experience to sort of go back in time and talk about some of these projects. So thanks for giving me the chance to come on the show.
Yeah, you're welcome. Anyway, that was I Helped Make That with our lovely guest, Josh Victor Rothstein. Bye now.
Let's go. Yo, I'm like an addict. Do I gotta have it? I ain't even